Given the vast presence Shingeki no Kyojin has had in the anime industry and even far outside of it, it should be no surprise that its ending has left its audience with divided opinions. I've seen everything from unequivocal praise to utter disgust. The range of feelings seem to cover the entire spectrum depending on who you ask. To someone it might be a 10 out of 10, but to others it might be a 1. The reality that a lot of people still seem to fail to realize is that there isn't really any right or wrong answer. Media is subjective. What a shocker, right? The relationship we all end up having with the media we consume will always depend on our own predisposition and what we ourselves bring into the experience. It is easy to criticize this finale for having plot holes, contrived conveniences, unexplained motivations, or other flaws that might pertain to the technical quality of the storytelling. For these things to all be nailed can certainly help make a product really hit hard and leave a particularly strong or awe-inspiring impression, but this isn't really all there is to making a worthwhile piece of art. Or rather, at least it isn't to me. I personally don't consume media for the sake of experiencing something that is bulletproof on a technical level. The thing that matters to me is that I want to be emotionally moved. I want to feel things. And I can certainly forgive an uneven execution if I can still feel a sense of passion in what the work is trying to communicate. These are the important notes to hit as far as I'm concerned. Not to see a show be akin to some perfect mathematical equation but while having no soul. When I was studying music, my guitar teacher would often tell me that when playing live, hitting the right notes on my instrument matters far less than having a passionate presence on stage. He would insist that if you have to choose between the two, it's much better for you to make a messy performance but to look like you're having the time of your damn life while doing it, than it is for you to make a perfect performance but to look bored and uninterested in the process. And this is indeed a trade-off many need to make. If I am to play a song correctly, I often need to focus so much that I end up standing completely still and wear a stone-faced expression which makes me look bored even though I'm having a blast. But if I make an effort to connect with my surroundings, focus on those around me, and maybe make it a point to exude some form of presence, then I'm very likely to play like shit because I'm not good enough to nail both things at the same time. But this would still be the better decision. And this same dilemma typically applies to most works of art too. Obviously, in an ideal world, the works we consume would nail both of these things, but usually creative minds struggle to strike a perfect balance and end up having to sacrifice one or the other. And in my personal opinion, this isn't really even a decision. Sacrificing the technical strengths for the sake of an emotional vision will always be the right way to go. Even the greatest products of all time can be subject to technical nitpicks. Nothing is really immune to this unless you look at something that has been intentionally constructed for the sole purpose of being technically flawless, but I seriously doubt such a product would have much character or soul. This all probably sounds like I'm taking the side of those who loved this finale, but that's not what I'm trying to say. There is plenty of merit in the opposite perspective as well, but the thing that matters the most is simply who we are. Are you an emotional or an objective person? Does the technical integrity of art matter a great deal to you or does it not? Are you the type of person who would start pointing out all the times a guitarist hit the wrong notes at a concert, or would you just vibe to the emotional presence of the band? Neither stance is any more correct than the other. The artworks that I would say are the most deserving of hate are those that are produced cynically. There are plenty of products that are made for the sole purpose of capitalizing on something successful and not for the sake of artistic passion or a desire to communicate an expression. I personally feel that the finale to Shingeki no Kyojin does not fall into this category. It has too much personality and expressiveness for me to look at it in that way. These episodes ended up providing more or less what I wanted, and thus I left my couch quite satisfied as the credits rolled. But that's obviously just me. So what was it that I wanted then? I wonder how a fan of Shingeki would answer if I would ask them what singular person was the most important to the production of this series for them. What person made the most significant contribution to make this show enjoyable for you? This would likely be a difficult question for most people, but I actually have a very clear-cut answer to this. Hiroyuki Sawano. Do you know who that is? You might, and otherwise you definitely should. He is the composer of the soundtrack in Shingeki no Kyojin and many other soundtracks in the anime space, and also outside of it too. And as far as I'm concerned, he is the best composer in the whole industry. I actually got into Shingeki no Kyojin pretty late. It took me all the way until 2017 before I started watching this series for the first time, and when I did, Hiroyuki Sawano's OST was what pushed me to start watching it. When I first got into anime, I started out by being incredibly into nerdy moe shows and slice of life stuff. I very rarely enjoyed the more mainstream shonen works, and so I didn't really seek them out, and Shingeki was no exception. I had always figured that it was this shallow and basic series aimed at westerners, and this was basically the antithesis of what I was interested in at the start of my anime career. But then one day I watched Kill la Kill and heard Sawano's works for the first time, and at that point I could no longer ignore Shingeki, because the Shingeki OST was in fact composed by this godly dude, and goddamn, his work on the Shingeki OST sure as hell did not disappoint. All of this matters because this paints a critical picture for what Shingeki no Kyojin was all about for me. The two most important factors to me was always the animation and the music, and the way these two elements cooperated with each other to create a package that was much more than the sum of its parts. I was never really all that hooked by the story, the characters or the world. The raw visceral action was what made this show special in my eyes. Everything else was just a vehicle to further these moments and add some context to them. And the fact that Linked Horizon came as a package deal was just this fucking amazing little bow on this whole package. This truly was the show to watch if you wanted a blood-pumping, kick-ass and just explosively hype experience. But a lot of people really did seem to be into this specifically for the story, and I could never really relate to them because my baggage was just different. So I can understand that these individuals might feel betrayed if their expectations for the technical details of the narrative were not sufficiently met in this finale. I felt a similar feeling when Mappa took over the production from Wit Studio, starting with the first part of the final season, or whatever the fuck you would call it. Because at that point, two of the most important pillars that carried this show for me just sort of crumbled. To me, the animation could not at all compare, and the music took an equally big hit. I didn't really understand what happened starting with this season. Sawano is still credited for the music, but it was just not the same. The visceral blood-pumping action was no more. Instead we had this more contemplative, slow burn war story that started to expand into all kinds of other things, and I just felt left behind. Linked Horizon was also no longer doing the openings or the endings, and thus my interest in this show started to drastically diminish. I also just didn't feel that the hype and intrigue that the show had been building up to all this time was met in a satisfying way. I realize this is also a heavily discussed topic, but I'm personally in the camp of just being incredibly underwhelmed by what was actually outside of the walls. I know that a lot of people consider these later seasons to be the show having matured and starting to tackle heavier themes. I suppose this is indeed fair enough. It definitely does comment on a lot of brutal aspects of human nature, so to anyone who finds this compelling, I'm sure it would be a good time. I did also appreciate some of these moments from time to time, but I was still always longing for more of the kick-ass and overly dramatic moments of the first seasons. I remember when Demolition D would comment on how these moments were so absurdly exaggerated in his review of this series, but whereas he thought it was too over the top, this was the thing that I absolutely fucking loved about this show.
Which can get a little over the top at times. I dropped my
So to finally tie all of this into the finale, I found this conclusion to be satisfying because in a lot of ways it finally went back to its roots. It once again gave me what I have been longing for all of this time. I still think that the animation is lagging behind what Wit Studio was providing in their seasons, but I do think this is the best that we've seen of Mappa's Shingeki. It certainly gets the job done for me. It's a far cry from the mess we saw in the first part of the final season. That initial encounter with the Hammer Titan was goddamn rough. And finally, Hiroyuki Sawano's compositions are back, and a whole lot of them too. Many songs from the earlier seasons are here again, but in slightly different arrangements. They aren't quite as in your face as they used to be, but they're close enough. They aren't as high in volume in the mix, and the arrangements themselves don't have the same intensity as they once did. They have a more soft character this time around, but we do have some more tracks that actually have vocals, which is a critical component of a Sawano OST as far as I'm concerned. And, at long last, Linked Horizon is back for one last hurrah. This was almost enough to bring a tear to my eye. It is difficult for me to sufficiently communicate just how much of an impact Linked Horizon's songs have had on my relationship with this series. When he was no longer doing neither the OP or the ED, it just didn't feel like the same show for me. It felt like a critically important part had been cut loose. like the show had gotten a lobotomy and was just a shadow of its former self. Maybe this sounds completely fucking crazy to some of you, but there are indeed all kinds of people with all kinds of baggage and thus all kinds of different ways to experience a piece of media. Linked Horizon contributed a great deal to giving this show its unique identity in my opinion, so having that aspect be lost was not the insignificant change to me. For all of these pillars to once again contribute to this series was more than enough to make me feel satisfied with the experience that I was given. As I've mentioned before, I've never really been all that engaged by the story in this show. It has never been an important factor in my enjoyment of this product as I've never found it to be all that compelling. But I did think this finale did an elegant job of wrapping up all of the plot points that were still relevant. There are a few things that detract from this, but none of them were a significant detriment to me. But for one, I've never been fond of how the paths work in this story. The notion that Eren can see the past, present and future all at once isn't really explored enough, and it is difficult for me as a viewer to fully grasp the rules behind how this works. If I don't understand the limitations of certain mechanics, it is difficult to know what can or cannot happen, which can end up making certain results feel unearned or contrived if indeed anything goes. Eren is insisting that the future cannot be changed no matter what happens, but the viewer isn't given enough context to understand what the obstacles are. We only have Eren's word to go on in terms of why there is no other way out of this situation than for Eren to sacrifice himself and 80% of humanity for the sake of everyone else. The footage we get to see in the credits did leave a decent impact for me, likely greatly enhanced by the fact that Linked Horizon was playing in the background of it. To get to see how war continues to rage even as civilization continues to advance even tens of thousands of years into the future is brutal, but almost certainly the ultimate fate of our species no matter how much time passes. When we finally get to see the end screen with the classic to be continued background, it struck a very strange chord for me. I've come to associate this background so heavily with the feeling of ignorance. In most cases where this has been shown, it has been at a point in the series where we have got no clue where things are going. No clue what's outside the walls or even what's in that damn basement. When I saw this just now in this finale, it almost felt like I was being reminded of a completely different show. I had such different expectations for where this story would be going, so at some point I think I started to feel some degree of disconnect with where things were actually heading, and in my head it still doesn't quite feel like the show I watched all those years ago has actually ended. It kind of feels like the show I used to watch was cancelled and that I've now watched something else. Like a part of me is still waiting on a different take on this entire premise, where Paradise Island isn't just some isolated island, and where the humans inside the walls is indeed the last of the species, standing against the Titans and whatever other mysteries might be awaiting beyond those walls. But regardless of which way things would go, this show was never going to end up being a masterpiece for me. I loved the hype and the visceral action, but I never felt a deep emotional connection to this work, and that's fine. It simply didn't do the things that I value the most in media, and it never even tried to. But I can't disregard the passion and effort that went into producing this work. And even though I was of a very different demographic than what the show was going for, I could still appreciate the blood, sweat and tears that had been poured into creating this series. Me and my baggage just happened to land in a position of relative indifference. If anyone at all is listening to this, maybe you were someone who loved this show and considers it to be an absolute masterpiece, because it happens to have done all of the things that you want from a piece of media. Or maybe you absolutely hated it, because you consider it to be everything that is wrong with art. Or maybe you loved it at first and then grew to hate the direction it later ended up going in. There are obviously infinite variations to how people could feel in regards to this work, and in regards to any work for that matter. But the only thing that should matter is your own feelings. It seems like a lot of people these days are obsessed with having the right opinion, even in circumstances where there is no such thing. Unless you're watching something like the Asterisk War, I guess, in which case there is indeed very much a wrong opinion. But for the most part, if you enjoyed something, then that's great. If you hated something, that is awesome too. It is important to acknowledge what we don't like, because we can't truly appreciate the things we do enjoy unless we also identify what we don't enjoy. This contrast is incredibly important to elevate the value of the works that we truly love. It feels strange to be bidding farewell to Shingeki no Kyojin after all of this time. It's wild how people who started watching this in their early teens are likely all adults now that may have families of their own at this point. Some viewers might even have been keeping up with this show for more than half of their lives. It must be hard to let go after these 10 long years. It's been really cool to see all of the different takes that people have had in regards to this finale. I respect how this series managed to go out in such a way that it would provoke such a wide breadth of discussion. Anyway, that's all I've got. Huge thanks for watching this far. I hope you have a cool day, and see you next time maybe.